Welcome, everybody, to this Historic St. Paul virtual presentation. Over the next hour, we'll be talking about the archaeology project conducted in the backyard of the historic John Lewis House located at 412 Goodrich Avenue in St. Paul. Sponsored by Historic St. Paul and led by archaeologist Jeremy Nino, the initial archaeological dig took place in the summer of 2018. The second phase of the project, an in-depth professional analysis of the unearthed artifacts, was completed over this past winter of 2019-2020. This analysis phase, again led by Jeremy Nino of Nino Cultural Consultants, was financed in part with funds provided by the state of Minnesota from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund through the Minnesota Historical Society. Jeremy and I met in mid-April 2020 to talk about the 412 Goodrich Archaeology Project. In this time of social distancing, we connected from our respective homes to talk online. Since only the audio of our conversation was recorded for an upcoming podcast release, you won't be watching the two of us. Instead, while you listen, you'll be seeing a treasure trove of images from the dig, the catalog artifacts, and the John Lewis House itself. But before we dive in, you should have a little background. The best place for all of the information about 412 Goodrich is on Historic St. Paul's website. Navigate to historicstpaul.org/412 Goodrich, spelling out Saint, S-A-I-N-T, and using the numerals 412. That's historicstpaul.org/412 Goodrich, spelled Goodrich. Here's a quick summary. The John Lewis House is a small 800-square-foot, one-story, wood-frame, pre-Civil War structure built in 1856. Left vacant since the end of 2015, it was slated for demolition in 2017 when neighbors involved in Little Bohemian Neighborhood Association partnered with Historic St. Paul in an ultimately successful effort to rehabilitate it. The archaeological dig at 412 Goodrich was part of this overall effort. So, please enjoy Jeremy's presentation, and be sure to head over to historicstpaul.org to learn much more about this project and the other great work Historic St. Paul is doing. Jeremy, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll get going.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Nino. I'm the owner and operator of Nino Cultural Consultants, an archaeology firm based here in the Twin Cities, right out of St. Paul. I'm a doctorate of archaeology from the University of Minnesota from about 15 years ago now, and have been a lifelong learner in archaeology, the study of humans by the things that we left behind.
What got you interested in historical archaeology, and even more specifically, the archaeology of early St. Paul?
Well, I went to UW-La Crosse to major in archaeology and history back in 1993. Did some work in the La Crosse area, and La Crosse is an early historic river town. Early St. Paul's getting going at the same time. During that time, I decided I wanted to go into historical archaeology, which was a early field that started in the 1960s. Went to Scotland, did some archaeology in Scotland, came back here, worked for the military in Wisconsin doing archaeology for a while, and then was able to do my master's degree work out in Virginia at the College of William and Mary, the second oldest college in the United States. And then I came back to Minnesota, where I was from originally, and did my PhD work. So I'd always been interested in historical archaeology, or this interaction between Native Americans and Euro-Americans, and had studied it primarily in a culture, first contact sort of thing with fur trade. And then when I came back to Minnesota to do my PhD work, I became really obsessed with the earliest historic or Euro-American settlement period here, where Minnesota is formed as a state, and that pre-territorial time. Finished my dissertation, graduated with my PhD, was very excited to be going off to do teaching, did some community college teaching and things for several years, and then eventually went back into doing archaeology as a full-time career, doing something called cultural resource management. I've lived in St. Paul since I got back in 2000, and now I live in the beautiful part of St. Paul in Irvine Park. So I've really always been fascinated by that early period of St. Paul's history when it got going. And now that I live in the area where just blocks away from 412, it's a part of St. Paul that has so many little hidden treasures and exciting side corners and alleyways. You can't help but fall in love with the place. So when I had the opportunity 2 years ago now to work on this property in a part of town that has seen very little archaeological work. It is one of the earliest communities in St. Paul, one of our first neighborhoods, if you will. Wasn't for the rich and famous. And we started building all these houses in the period in the 1850s and 60s, and we don't get sanitation really until the 1880s that we could talk a little bit about later on. It's a place where a lot of early immigrants, first Germans and sort of the traditional Norwegian and other groups come in, and then after that it becomes really a place that's dominated by Bohemians and later Italians, as you well know, like today with Casetas. So that's where I got interested in it. And when John Yost and the good folks at Historic St. Paul said, we have this great opportunity to do some archaeology in the backyard. We think there could be a privy in the backyard, which is an early outhouse. Would you like to come and take a look at it? And of course, I said, absolutely. Let's see what's there. So that was the start of this. Now, 2 years ago, it's been a great long process, and I'm excited to share it with you today.
Excellent. Yeah, so it seems like it's right in your wheelhouse. You mentioned being interested in the period prior to statehood. The John Lewis House, built in 1856. If I've got my dates correct, that's a few years shy of Minnesota becoming a state. And I just wanted to mention, you can also go to Historic St. Paul's sister app, St. Paul Historical, again spelled out, SAINTPAUL, historical.org, or look for St. Paul Historical, the app, in whatever app store your devices get their apps from, and just type in West 7th in the search area, and you will see a plethora of material about the neighborhood that Jeremy's describing. There are some tours, some video tours, as well as some essays and photos about the different ethnic communities that populated the area all the way up until the present day. You can dive in and get some deeper information about a lot of the topics that we're talking about today and that Jerry just mentioned. So you got approached by John Yost in Historic St. Paul to take a look at the backyard and figure out what might be underneath the backyard. Can you talk a little bit about that first phase of the project, the actual archaeological digging?
Sure. And I want to say, too, right off the bat, that this was a public archaeology event. Myself and a couple of other professional archaeologists, Fred Sutherland and Laura Koski, we were all three involved. All three of us worked together at Cultural Consultants. But John really thought it was important that we have people from the neighborhood get involved, and they were all very excited to do so. So with background information that had been provided by historians in the area, we knew that the backyard had a shed, and there was a smaller house that was also in the backyard, and that somewhere in front of those should be a privy or an outhouse. So John originally thought maybe we should dig in the back corner of the lot because there was a building that was on a Sanborn insurance map. But we started digging in the very back corner, and then after a day, we shifted just slightly farther north and used a couple of very low-tech techniques to try to find where this privy could be at. And luckily, on our second day, on July 22nd, when we were out there, we found the privy and started doing a little bit of excavation there. Normally, archaeologists like to do things in a very scientific and thoughtful, methodologically laid out direction. We grid out entire areas. We do lots of photography, lots of map making. We approach projects very seriously and methodologically. This project was a little bit different in the sense that we had a short-term opportunity. We didn't know a tremendous amount about the property going into it, except that we knew it was quite old, from the 1850s. And we assumed that people that lived there were potentially Bohemian in ancestry because it today is dominated by Little Bohemia, which turns out didn't really start until the 1870s. But, we figured that out later. But we also just had a lot of labor power. Woman power, man power, small child power, lots of people that were interested in being out there. So how we approached it is we basically strung out squares on the ground that were several feet in size, like 4 feet in size, made these squares, and then I slowly excavated off 4 inches of soil at a time. Put that into buckets. We then took those buckets over to a series of screens that we had set up away from where we were going to be digging. It's always smart to make the big pile of dirt away from where you're digging because invariably you're going to dig underneath that big pile at some point. And we started looking for materials and screening through that, and volunteers immediately were finding lots of interesting things in the back corner. We excavated down about a foot in that back corner and hit bedrock, and we all sighed. And we're like, oh no, we missed
I remember that day. My whole family was out there at the screens.
What happened? Right. I mean, people were finding all kinds of exciting pieces of broken pottery and glass and metal and toys and exciting things that were from the surface going down that first foot. And then we shifted north a little bit. What we used is a soil probe to push down into the ground. And I knew that, well, bedrock should be about a foot down. So I'd push the probe into the ground. It would hit a foot down. It'd hit into solid rock, and I'd stop. I'd move a little bit farther north. Do that again, stop. Move a little farther north, stop. A little farther north, probe went all the way to the ground. And I was like, well, that's kind of odd. So we set up our next square on that next day on July 22nd, and a 4-foot square. Started excavating in 10 centimeter or 4-inch levels. Archaeologists do everything in the metric system. So when I say centimeters, there's 10 centimeters in every 4 inches roughly of soil. So we would dig down in 10 centimeter levels or 4-inch levels. And within 2 levels, within first 20 centimeters or 8 inches of soil, we knew we were in the right place. We were getting a lot of ash, and we started to find an outline from stone of a square. And as we dug deeper and deeper, we got to the point where we were well below where bedrock should have hit us and encountered it, and we were still going down. And eventually, we went down 5 feet.
Wow.
We came back and did that. We came back in August and finished it. We couldn't get it all done that first weekend. Then we had some rain in between. We covered everything up. And then we came back on August 11th to do one more final day to get to the very bottom of this privy vault. And as we were excavating it, we knew that the things on the surface, just based on early first blush things, we saw a lot of modern stuff on the surface, aluminum tops from cans and pantyhose and other things from the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And by the time we got to the bottom of the privy vault, a couple of things had been made clear to us. The first was that there wasn't a lot of privy kind of stuff in the privy vault itself. Normally, privies are full of something called night soil, which is decomposed human feces mixed with lime and ash and other things to sweeten or cut down the smell. We didn't find a lot of that kind of soil. We were finding a lot of ash and more ash and more ash. And in that ash, we were finding interesting artifacts, but a lot of faunal material and broken bits of crockery and glassware. When we get to the very bottom of the privy, down 5 feet, the very last inch of it definitely was night soil, and we knew that. And then in that layer, we had our earliest bottles and things, and we'll talk a little bit about those later, but we found an 1880s cold cream jar from out on the East Coast. And so that gave us a date range. So at the very, very top of it, we have things from the 1960s, and then at the very bottom of it, we have things from the 1880s from that privy vault. So although the house was built in 1856, our materials all come from 1880s to the 1960s. So later on, when we started the second phase of this that you alluded to earlier, that's the time period that we really focused our research on.
Are you able to tell? It sounds like if you're going 10 centimeters at a time, something like 12 to 15 layers?
Yeah, 16 layers that we excavated. Yep, all the way down to level 16, 150 to 160 centimeters below ground surface.
How do you determine, or what are the methods for determining at each layer what date period of artifact you're finding?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, well, one of the things we do know from excavating privies, essentially how a privy happens is somebody cuts a square into limestone in this case and lines it usually with wood around the top of it to build a frame, and then they have an outhouse on the top of it. I should also say that in the process of, since we dug the square slightly larger than the privy itself was, we have a lintel. We have one long limestone block that was oriented to the east, and we were able to determine that that was where the door was at, because the original outhouse, the whatever was above it, doesn't exist anymore. But archaeologists use a whole variety of different tools to figure out the time periods from which the artifacts, or trash, if you will, comes from. Sometimes we get really lucky, and there's a date right on the artifact. For example, we found the back of a pocket watch that has a patent date from the 1880s, so we knew, this is from the 1880s. Mm-hmm. That cold cream jar, some of those things have a lot of lettering on them. The jars themselves, the way that they're manufactured, the different kinds of seams that are on them for early manufacturing styles for bottles, from early hand-blown things to one seam and then two seam, tops that are hand-finished, and then tops that eventually become machine-finished. So we look at the manufacturing style for artifacts. We also know from the amazing thing called the internet, where people love to collect and study the most minute of objects. Everyone has that favorite thing from their childhood, or maybe it was something that your parents gave you, or it's just really pretty that you like to study. So people have pages devoted to every kind of ceramic and glassware and toy, and they do a lot of research. They go back through catalogs, which is what we do. We go through the old Montgomery Wards and Sears catalogs. So sometimes we get lucky and we have a date right on the artifact, but a lot of times it's hard work and research efforts to determine when things are from, or we know the manufacturing styles and when those time periods of both style and manufacture were occurring.
As somebody that participated in these digs, when we were finding some of these artifacts that you're talking about, we all wanted to square ourselves away right then and figure out exactly what the provenance of each of these things were.
So tempting.
But that's not exactly what we did and not what you recommended that we do. Talk a little bit about how these bits and pieces and artifacts, what happened to them once they were unearthed in the backyard.
Right. Well, you can get easily distracted when you're doing archaeology, especially in historical archaeology, because there's a whole lot of exciting pieces. Well, one of the first things we do in the field is we set up a protocol for what things we're going to keep and what things we're just going to note and maybe discard. So while people were finding the really exciting pieces like the watch back and pieces of ceramic and glassware, those they were instantly attracted to and they wanted to keep those. We also have, and more than a third of the entire collection is boring stuff, architectural things. So nails, which a lot of people aren't very excited by nails, nails and broken pieces of brick, plaster, wood, all of those fragments, and then faunal material or bone. What we do is in the field, we normally try to keep as much as we possibly can of everything. But if it's something like it's architectural, so brick, once you have a lot of the different brick styles or types, if you have whole bricks, we certainly keep those. But smaller fragments of brick, we would document and weigh and discard. Plaster, the same sort of thing. If you have lots of ash, or in our case, one of the largest things that we threw out a lot of was clinker. Clinker is the waste product from burning coal or wood in a stove, and it's all that non-burnable stuff that conglomerates and congeals at the bottom of your stove. You clean your stove out and you throw that stuff away. So it's melted stuff. And we would document that, and we would discard a lot of that in the field. So we set up a protocol for what we would keep. Every level, we'd have artifact bags with the provenience of what unit we were excavating and how deep below the surface we were. And then we methodically kept that information. We kept those bags separate from each other. And we really tried to encourage people not to take something out of one bag and put it into another bag, because that would change what level something came from. Once we had all of the information excavated out of the ground, and then each time when we stopped after 4 inches, we would draw a map of the unit. We would take photographs of the unit so we would know exactly how it changes over time, and then we would continue on with the process. So I got the privilege of doing most of the excavational work along with Laura Koski, and then the volunteers were primarily the ones finding all of the good things, which I didn't see right away. There was a whole bunch of oohs and ahs that were always happening, and excited kids that were finding all kinds of cool stuff. I was 5 feet down in the ground digging the hole. So once we did all of the archaeology, we brought it back to the lab, and we spent that second Sunday of work that we were at processing and washing some of the materials. And at that point, the project kind of stopped. We went into a hiatus, if you will. The materials were put into 2 boxes for long-term storage as we thought about what the next steps for this, because Historic St. Paul certainly wanted to do something proper with these artifacts. They wanted to make sure that they got cleaned, processed, analyzed, and ultimately curated with an historical society or an appropriate place for storing objects long-term. But they didn't necessarily know what they wanted to do with them right at that point. So they went into long-term storage here at Nino Cultural Consultants, and then Historic St. Paul went after funding, grant funding, and then ultimately received that from a Minnesota Legacy Amendment grant. And the purpose of that grant was really to do 2 things. One, it was to completely process all of the materials, get them clean to professional standards, and then create a catalog from those materials. So an exact number of, okay, in this bag, there's this many things, and a description of those. Do an analysis of those. So what kinds of faunal material do we have? What kinds of animals do they come from? What kind of bottles do we have? What do we know about those bottles? Once that was done, put it all into a report, and then get that information back out to the public. So we had 2 primary things, processing and then reporting out to the public, and that's the process that we're doing right now.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about how you went about that process? Because it's not all just looking up what kind of nail we have, right? Where you're trying to put it into context. How did you begin this process? Did you analyze all the objects, then look at the history involved and try to make those connections? Or did you do it the other way around? Give a little bird's eye view of, or maybe groundhog view of how we went about this process.
Mole
yeah,
view.
the mole in the ground.
The mole view, yeah. Well, we knew from when we did the original archaeology that artifacts were roughly in this time periods from the late 1880s to the 1960s, because we had artifacts that were at these two extremes in our collection. And we also knew that the house was, at least 30 years older than that, but we didn't have artifacts from that time period. So knowing that information, the first thing that we did was go out and figure out who was living in the property in the 1880s up until the 1960s. And the way we went about that is a documentary sleuthing, I like to call it. So you can look at census records. You can also look at social directories and business directories for St. Paul. Those social directories, you can think of those as early phone books that also listed your occupation in them, what you did, who was living at your house. After we did those, we also looked at insurance maps called Sanborn maps that show for neighborhoods how houses are built, what kind of materials they're built out of course, for insuring that property. We did some of that. We also looked at building and demolition permits to try to figure out more about the families that were there, because typically when you want to do something to your house and you live within the city of St. Paul, there are ordinances that require you to go out and get a permit. We all know that sometimes we do small things in our house that we don't get a permit for, and we just hope that nobody notices. But for big things like adding additions to your house, or maybe totally remodeling your bathroom, and when you have to throw a bunch of stuff out and it's really obvious to your neighbors what you're doing, it also gets obvious to the city. So those demolition and construction efforts, usually you have to go out and get a permit for. So using a combination of census information and social directory information, and then these building permits and maps, we were able to figure out that there were a whole slew of families that lived in this property after it was built. And one family in particular, the Walla family, are the ones that we spent a lot of our time focused on. So starting with the 1880 census, we know that there was a family of Anton and Annie Walla, and they had Joseph, Annie, Mary, Emily, and Rosa, their kids. Several of their kids were born here in the United States, but Anton and his wife Annie and their oldest child Joseph were actually all born in Bohemia. So the census record for the 1880 lists where you were born originally, and these people were all from Bohemia. I'll backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about the Bohemian idea. So when people first started living in this part of St. Paul, primarily St. Paul starts out as essentially a fur trade post where people trading with early Native Americans, and it's the wild, wild west through the 1840s and 50s, and until we become a little more organized during that period. So the first folks that lived in this part of town, this West 7th area, were primarily Canadian, French, German, Irish, and Swedish settlers. But by the 1870s, there was a large influx of populations from Czechoslovakia, Czech, Slovak, Italian, and Polish immigrants. So this Bohemian area includes Germany, Moravia, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Bohemians were coming into Minnesota and setting up entire communities, places like New Prague, Owatonna, Hopkins, Silver Lake. Those were all being settled by people from this part of Central Europe. By the 1870s, there's more than 250 Czech settlers in Ramsey County, and most of them live right on West 7th Street. And we know that there's such a large community by this 1870 period that they start to do major upgrades to institutions. So they build the St. Stanislav of Kostka Church in 1872, and they also build a really important and very nifty hall that's still there today. And that community hall was built in the 1879, and then the first one burned down, and then they built the second one in 1887, and it's still there today, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. People are really interested in their Czechoslovakian heritage. The local Czech Society has published several books based on people's dissertations about growing up in this part of town, and the little Bohemian neighborhood has still flourished to this day. You can go out and walk. They've been doing some nature upgrades and things with the city, and people are definitely interested in it. So the Walla family comes in right during that time period. So they're there in the 1880s, and they live in the house until 1820s. And we know that there's 2 houses that ultimately are on the property for a period of time, and that the family moves back and forth between these 2 houses when sometimes they have a tenant that lives in the front house and then they move to the back house, and other times they're the ones living in the front house. And that's based on census records and insurance maps. But after the family is gone in the 1920s, for shorter periods of time, there are several other families that live in the area, including the Codys that lived there in the 1920s, the Kings that lived there in the 1930s, the Carrolls that lived there in the 1940s, the Harrisons that also lived there in the 1940s, and then the Peterson family that lives there in the 1950s and 60s. So there are 2 families in particular that most of the materials that we have likely come from. The Walla family that was there from the 1880s into the 1920s, and then the Peterson family that's there in the 1950s and the 1960s. They both have kids. They're both doing interesting things right here in St. Paul. We know from social directories and census that Anton was a tailor and that Annie was a teacher. Their oldest kid was a tinsmith. So we know lots of little pieces of information about their lives. So that was the first place that we started. We really wanted to know who was living in this to the best of our ability without some of the key pieces. We'd love to find and do more research on diaries, journals, maybe contact relatives of these individuals that lived in the area. We do know, and we'll talk about this, I hope, a little bit later on, that some of these families traveled and had connections to relatives in a lot of other parts of the United States, especially in the East Coast and in Michigan. And we know that from some of the artifacts that they left behind. So we know they take travel and trips. They're interested in, we have lots of everyday objects in their lives, but they're connected to the wider, not only Minnesota, but also the United States. And we'd love to have some of those stories that we can only get the kind of information from personal contact, maybe oral tradition or history from families or their journals or diaries. Maybe we could get lucky and find some newspaper articles or find a little bit more. For example, Annie is a teacher, and we found a little musical instrument insignia from like when you were like in band and you had it on your letter jacket.
Right.
So maybe Annie taught music or something like that. The way we could find out is we could look back through all the early schools that were operating in the area in the time period, and we can try to look at some of their school records, people's yearbooks, and see if we can find some pictures of these folks. But that's where we started. We started with the documentary record, and then from there we went back into the archaeological record and see how the 2 reflected each other.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I was talking before, I mentioned that, roughly we had 3,000 artifacts that we kept from the collection. There was probably several hundred more that we didn't keep because they were plaster and clinker, waste materials for fuel, nails. You keep as many whole nails as you can. You don't keep a lot of the nail fragments. There's 2 types of nails that people really are interested in, square nails and round nails. And we see a transition from square or cut-made, machine-cut nails in the 1880s into right around the turn of the 20th century. After that, we have wire nails or round nails, and we still use round nails today. We've just changed the coatings on the outsides of the nails a little bit and the kind of material that we make them out of. So we kept a lot of those things as well. So we had about 3,000 objects. A third of the collection was architectural in nature, so building materials and brick fragments. Another third of the collection was glassware fragments. And that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Glass breaks really easily. And so if we're just counting a raw number of objects, a lot of the times you get a tremendous amount of glass. One pane of glass can break into thousands of little shards of glass. If you ever drop a glass in your house, and you're surprised or shocked when it only breaks into like 6 pieces. You can pick them all up and throw them in the trash. Well, this is what people were doing at this property as well, is they were cleaning up the stuff around their house and things in their stove, and they were throwing it out into this privy. What we figured out by looking at the archaeological record and then later on by the documentary record is that our privy, which really turned out not to be a privy, probably was cleaned out in the 1880s. And then after that was used as a secondary, I don't think primary, but probably a secondary place for getting rid of materials, less in a trash way. We know that because of our earliest artifact that the 1880 period is very important. And when we did research, we found out that St. Paul came up with this first health ordinance. They set up a health board in 1883. The paper of record during the time was the St. Paul Daily Globe, and they published in the very back of the paper. It's an 8-page paper, starting on page 6, we have the health ordinance and describing setting up a health board. And this health board would do all kinds of different things in the city. But one of the things they were also in charge of was sanitation and setting up protocols and rules for people that would come and get rid of all of the night soil that was on your property. And they required that if your sanitation efforts of the time were not up to snuff, i.e. you were using a privy that maybe was not up to the ordinance code, that you had to clean that out and stop using it. And this part of St. Paul was also in the 1880s. I think the reason these things correspond pretty well, we were just starting to see some kinds of plumbing that were happening at this time. So in 1883, on October 25th, that's when they published this ordinance. And I think within 2 years of that, our privy was cleaned out. And they stopped using it as a privy, and they started using it as a place to get rid of stuff out of their stove and things from around the house, things that the pets clearly had gotten a hold of. We'll talk a little bit about that later, too.
Is that common practice, do you think, all around St. Paul?
Absolutely. Well, my parents, my mother in particular, grew up on a family farm in southeastern Minnesota down in Casson. And you would dig a hole for the privy, and she was one of 10 kids, a lot of kids. You dig a hole for the privy would get filled up, you dig another hole for the privy, and you keep moving around. In the city, you can't do that. You can maybe do 1 or 2 privies, but eventually you're going to run out of places to have a hole. So you would have your privy cleaned out, and then you'd keep using it. And so there were actually individuals that had wagons, and they were able to come and get this night soil. The ordinance talks about how your wagon had to be constructed, how you had to, and there's all this information about these collectors of night soil. That might be our next podcast. We can talk about night soil collection. So we figured that out about the privy, which was interesting. So we have a lot of glassware, and then the remainder of the collection, the last third of the collection, is ceramics, faunal material, toys, trinkets, mementos, and things that tell us a lot about daily life. So yes, we get really exciting individual objects, and we'll talk about a few of those. But we also have a lot of things from daily life that you and I, might typically discard a thing. So like, for example, laundry detergent, right? You get a big jug of laundry detergent, you finish the laundry detergent, you put it out in the recycling or the trash, and you don't think anything of it. So we have soap bottles. We have a laundry soap bottle from the time period. We have broken scissors from the time period from doing at home sewing and sewing kits. We have the parts of that pocket watch. We have lots of plates and glassware and other things that were just daily life objects that honestly archaeologists find the most interest in. They're tangible things that you can hold in your hand that connect you immediately to the past. And I think that's why archaeology is the most interesting of all the anthropological fields, because you really can hold it in the palm of your hand. We have hair curlers and typical things just from everyday life. And then we also get things that connect you to their surrounding community. So we found, people did like to drink in this house. Somebody did in the past. And so they have bottles from the York Brewery. And the York Brewery was one of the first operating breweries in the city, and it operated for a long period of time. And we have bottle pieces from York Brewery bottles. And then we have little Bavarian toothpick holders, ceramic toothpick holder pieces. We have lots of different, very beautiful, inexpensive ceramic things, jadeite and Depression era glassware and ceramics that tell us about everyday life in this family. So we have those normal pieces, and then we get some things that tell us more specific information about diet. So we have a faunal collection. It's not a tremendously large faunal collection. In terms of, if you look at privy excavations that were actually done in Minneapolis and similar households, because we don't have a lot of information for excavations here in St. Paul, because this could be one of the first excavations of this style, this neighborhood. We've done some archaeology, of course, where the Excel Center's at, and we're in the lower town neighborhoods, and there's the early places of ill repute and things that have been excavated out that way. But we don't have a lot of just someone's house from the 1850s where we have an opportunity to do excavation yet, which is why I think this project was so interesting. But the faunal collection is primarily cow, some pig, a little bit of sheep or goat, and then some bird and a little bit of fish. But the cuts of meat tell us a lot about the family, the style of cuts, the lower. These weren't high-end cuts. These were stew meats and trotters and other things from lower parts of animals that were really staples of Central European diet. So we have these pieces that connect us all back to the same little Bohemian or Bohemian families that we know are living in the property.
I'm assuming a little more research might be able to tell us where the butchering was done.
I really hope so.
Whether it was local butcher shops in the neighborhood, or I'm guessing that you would probably be able to tell if they were doing their own butchering based on maybe of what would be there. I'm not sure.
I don't think they're probably doing their own butchering at all, because we don't have the whole animal. We only have very small portions of animals. So they're getting cuts of meat from the local butcher shop. And that's actually another line of research that I'd love to tackle is, and I've started thinking about more of, is who runs the butcher shops in Lower St. Paul, along West 7th Street during this time period. I would assume that people want to go to somebody that speaks maybe their same language of origin. Maybe there's a German or Bohemian or Czech butcher that's in the area that knows the kinds and styles of cuts of meat that you enjoy using and will sell you those. Some other parts of the faunal collection, we've got some duck that's collected. We've got some fish that are some channel fish, like catfish and things that are in the collection. So they're being locally fished and then going, and they're probably getting either they're doing the fishing themselves because we have one fishing lure that we found in the collection. So maybe they're doing the fish themselves. They're getting it from a sport fisher. We have the bird pieces. We have a pheasant, which, interesting enough, here we can do a whole nother talk on pheasants. Pheasants don't come to Minnesota until the 1900s, believe it or not. They're introduced into America in the 1880s, and then they get to us by the 1930s. And then everybody goes pheasant hunting after that. They're really popular. So either someone on the property was engaging in hunting, or most likely they probably got it from somebody else. So we have a really small collection of fall material, but it gives us an insight into the diet, everyday diet of people in this house. And on the whole, they are eating traditional foods that I think a lot of us today would be familiar with in terms of their cuts of beef, and they're not doing exciting. They're not cutting steaks every day. They're not doing racks of ribs every day, but they're eating a lot of staples of everyday life, and they're eating it off of wares that are interesting and exciting to them, and they're very pretty to look at. They're beautiful to look at. They're relatively inexpensive to buy. They're not really high-end ceramics or glassware that really are just the everyday lifestyle for this family.
Did you find anything that surprised you about the collection?
Oh boy. There's a few surprises in the collection, and some of them are things that an archaeologist would be like, oh, okay, I can see how that can make an interesting connection to the household. And then there's some things that I've never seen in my entire archaeological career.
Now we get to the important stuff.
Now this is the juicy stuff. So we totally expected, once we did the documentary record things, we totally expected to see everyday life objects from a family, this 1880s up into the 1950s. We expected to see those kinds of things. We know we had kids, so we expected to find toys and stuff. So those pieces and the things that we found, they were great, and they reinforced how we do archaeology and how archaeology and the documentary record tie together. And then we started to find a few things that were outside of the normal. So, for example, we found a keychain fob that connected us to Michigan, to Wyandotte, Michigan. It was like, if they found return to this chemical plant in Wyandotte, Michigan, this little trinket or trade piece that was kind of interesting. In the faunal collection, we had, we found fish, local fish. We found local oyster or clamshell. We thought that was very normal and made a lot of sense, and we could tell about that.
Oysters and clamshells.
Yep. Yeah. Oysters and clamshells. Yeah. Down from the Mississippi River. Okay. But we also found a oyster shell that is as big as your hand, an adult male hand, big oyster shell. It definitely did not come from Minnesota. And in looking at this shell had a lot of weathering on it. It clearly had been laying out on the surface for a period of time, and natural processes had been working on it before it ended up in the privy. And that really got me thinking. But the shell type really is a marine shell that goes all the way along the East Coast, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a large shell. We'll show a picture of it. But this shell was most likely found either on a family trip or by a relative and given to the family, and they used it in some capacity in their house. And this immediately had a small tie for me. I'm a Minnesota boy, did archaeology in the upper Midwest, and then I got to go to William & Mary to do my master's degree work. And when I lived in Virginia, I went down to the Atlantic coast, and we would look for large shells and things, and I found a Jeffersonian era scallop shell that's, again, as big as my hand, and we still use that as a soap dish in our house to this day. And I could see the family doing something exactly the same. So that was interesting. I was like, okay, we got a couple of strange objects that connect us to wider parts of the world. We certainly expected to find things like your beer bottle that make complete sense, and fragments of everyday glassware and things. But finding something like those was interesting. And then when we dug deeper into the faunal collection, we had a small set of finger bones. That's where the music cuts in. That's where the music cuts in there. Boom, boom, boom. We found these finger bones, and they're the phalanges of the hand, set of finger bones. It was clear that they weren't human, so we'll stop the tape right there. No human remains were found at 412. But also, they didn't belong to a dog or a cat or a bear or anything. We to do our kind of faunal analysis, our faunal expert goes and looks at comparative collections that are available at the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, and the Science Museum. And it didn't belong to any of these. It didn't have a claw like any of those, but it was definitely a primate hand. So we started looking into the very, very small primate collection that's available at the Science Museum, and it's a monkey's hand, or more commonly known as a monkey's paw, that we found in the collection. That's the first monkey's paw I've ever found in my entire archaeological career. So we only have several of the phalanges, but they're all from the same hand. And at some point, this unfortunate monkey lost its hand, and it ended up in the family collection as a monkey's paw trinket, most likely. And then the family cat most likely got a hold of it, because there are cat puncture marks in some of the phalanges. And then eventually Mom or Dad threw it in the trash. The monkey's paw story, of course, as I'm sure we all know, is in a short story that comes out in 1902, 1903, first published in Great Britain. It's a horror story. This sort of idea that you make a set of wishes and this monkey's paw grants you the wishes, but the wishes all go horribly wrong in some way. And it's part of this sort of dark horror genre that becomes very popular. Later on, there's plays that get made about it. We tried to do research on monkey's paws. There is not a lot of research out there. I'm really hoping maybe someone's listening to this program now and has done a lot of research on the occult and trinkets and monkey's paws. But I think it was you or somebody turned me on to the idea of looking at comic books. And in the back of comic books, you could actually, not only could you buy monkey's paws, but you could buy an entire monkey.
Oh my gosh.
For sale.
When are we talking about here? Like what time period?
In the 1930s, I believe, is when my comic book was for fun. So yeah, it was like, I think it was $18. They would send you an entire monkey. I hope it was alive at that time, but so you could also buy monkey's paws.
But you just found the paw.
We have no other bones. We only have these few phalanges.
So it wasn't a family pet.
No, I don't think it was a family pet. Oh my goodness. I would really like to do some more excavations of some of the backyards of these places in the little Bohemian neighborhood. It's still a vibrant, active, beautiful. I walk through it almost every single day, and I know that there's similar backyard trash deposits or midden deposits where we could, maybe we'll find some. If we find a whole bunch of these monkey's paws, we might be on to something different. So there's little things like that, besides normal kids' toys like marbles and toy trucks, and the object that dates the latest in the excavation, which is a yo-yo that's shaped like a golf ball. Oh. It's from 1965. You could probably buy that in an antique shop today, or go and buy it online. So that's the latest artifact that we find. And then, of course, the Cheeseboro cold cream jar from 1883 is my other one. So those kinds of personal items really connect this whole collection together, and then leads to interesting other research questions, which I hope will ultimately be the next step in this process. So now that the materials have been cataloged, every object was photographed, and a catalog, which is in the appendix to the report, a full report's been put out to Historic St. Paul. The objects will be going into a qualified repository here in the near future, and that researchers can use that collection as a comparative collection to other archaeology that gets done. I know for a fact that there will be archaeology that's going to be happening in the West 7 area, because the historic Fort Road, which connected St. Paul to historic Fort Snelling, which becomes West 7th Street eventually. We're going to be doing some transportation upgrades along that route. Maybe we'll get a streetcar. Maybe we'll have some kind of metro transit system besides buses that goes down it. And ultimately, that's going to trigger more archaeology to get done. I'm hoping that this collection can then be a starting point for those archaeologists that are doing their own research at that point to compare and maybe start finding out more of the lives and stories of the other people that lived in this neighborhood.
That's exactly what Historic St. Paul is aiming to do. By the time many of the people that are listening to this, those objects will have been donated and will be available for study. Online, there will be the catalog and the photographs and the documentary information that you've put together about it will be available. And then the objects themselves via appointment will be available to be looked at physically. And I'm pretty sure that we'll also be able to make your entire report available digitally to people.
That's great.
And we'll put the details on historicstpaul.org. Once that happens, again, go to the 412 Goodrich page, historicstpaul.org/412 Goodrich. Any information about this project that we'll be making available will either be at that spot or linked there. You've talked a little bit about this, but what type of research do you hope happens from this? Will you be looking to do more research on this?
I would love to do more research, and I've been doing it. You know, we've had this period of time where we couldn't go out and do a lot of things in our society. So I've been communicating with folks at the local Minnesota Czech Society and folks in the Little Bohemian neighborhood, and starting to get some information from them. There's been an awful lot of research about the Italian enclave that formed sort of during the same time period. We're really hoping that someone can do some specific digging into these families. And I think one of the best ways to do that is figuring out people who are living today, relatives, and contacting those individuals. You know, there are a whole slew of families that lived in that house and in recent memory. So within a generation or two, you could have grandparents. We know the Walla family. We know that, you know, Mom and Dad Walla, they died, and that the oldest, Joseph, and things like that, they're not alive. But the youngest kid, Rosa, could potentially still be alive at this time. We could do some research into that. But, you know, I touched on this a little bit before. It's the connection of this house to the wider Little Bohemian neighborhood that I'm really interested in. The Foodways connects us into butcher shops. And the bottles connect us to the York Brewery, which connects us to other breweries in the area. And there's been a resurgence of recently with the opening of places like Waldman's Brewery, just a couple blocks away from this house, that people are really starting to get interested in the historic 1850s, 60s, and 70s time period in St. Paul. And it's not the really exciting, the red light district stuff. It's not the homes of the rich and the famous. It's the houses of everyday people like you and I that are living out here and making their first forays into Minnesota. That's the kind of research I really would want to do. You know, I want to try to find some specific research questions about where did Annie, for example, teach, who had a connection to Wyandotte, Michigan, and, you know, how could they have gotten that keychain fob? Did they have any relatives that lived on the East Coast? Or maybe, you know, can we find some kind of anecdotal information about a family trip that they took to Louisiana and they found that shell? You know, when you have that story that connects directly to that artifact, that makes a link for anybody, not just an archaeologist, to figure that out. And then, you know, there's a lot of research into monkey paws that I think we could really do here. I'm fairly certain that no one else in the state of Minnesota has found a monkey's paw on an excavation here. So that's a really exciting piece.
Well, that's what's wonderful about this project as a whole, not just the archaeology part, but saving the house itself. And the house is not being turned into a museum. It's being preserved on the spot and has been renovated. I believe it's complete now. We're recording this in April of 2020. The house has been renovated back to be a single family home again in the neighborhood and sold to the type of family that lives in the West 7th neighborhood now. So the history of Little Bohemia can continue on through that particular house, and now having a much deeper understanding of what life was like, not just back in 1856 when it was built, but all the way up through the history of that house. I think it's just a fascinating touchstone that will carry through whatever family buys and lives in this house moving forward, or families, because now it's going to be a solid home into the future.
Yeah, we also did I'll jump in here for a moment, Barry. We did a virtual tour of the space early on in renovation. We created a Matterport virtual model, if you will, of the property. And so you can look at what it was like just as it was starting the renovation process. You can even go down into the house as a whole doesn't have a basement, but it has a small cellar that is dug right into the limestone, just like that privy was. And so you have a sense of the small crawl space that's down there. That has not changed since that addition was added. I'll say that we know that the Walla family actually added that addition because we have the building permit that Anton took out in 1886 to build that 18 by 24 foot addition to the original house. So, you can talk about you had this little connection and experience, and then suddenly you find the documentary record that proves exactly what was going on and when it happened. But then, no one's writing about monkey's paws in the permit record. So those kind of pieces are why archaeology will continue to always mystify and really draw people to our human past.
You mentioned that you'd love to see more archaeology done in the same style in the area of Little Bohemia. But what about people listening to this? What if they are living in a property in St. Paul or wherever and are wondering, well, what lies in my backyard?
Right. Well, there's a couple ways you could go about that. One of the ways is you can dig some holes yourself in your backyard. Everybody does this, whether they're putting in a fence line, they're putting in a clothesline or something like that, and they're digging their own holes. They're just doing gardening most likely, and they're turning over the soil and they're finding things from the past. You can do your own research online to try to find out information about those. I have a lot of neighbors in the immediate Irvine Park who live in very historic old homes, who routinely, when they're out doing gardening, they find stuff every year. And now that I live there, I've only been living there for, 6 months now. And now that they know who I am, I guarantee you come springtime here in the next couple of weeks when people are doing their gardening, I'm going to be getting a lot of Facebook contacts and a lot of pictures saying, what is this? Where was this found? There's a lot of landscaping that's happening. One of the best places, though, to start is by going to a place like Historic St. Paul and looking at their website and that kind of information. You can also reach out to the Minnesota Archaeological Society, which is our avocational archaeology group that's hundreds of members strong. It's very old, more than 100, almost 100 years old. Archaeological Society here formed for people just like hobbyists, if you will. They're very interested in the past. We have a professional archaeological society here called the Council of Minnesota Archaeology. They host an archaeology conference every other year that's open to the public, that has papers from the work that people are doing. I'm completely going to be giving a paper. No spoiler there. I'm going to have a paper about this excavation, and I'm probably going to lead with monkey paw in the title because that's going to bring a lot of people to my talk. And I've also been doing a lot of work up at Fort Snelling and other places that's been recently quite interesting. So I have a lot of papers I'll be giving at that. The Minnesota Historical Society is another place to go. We also have an Office of the State Archaeologist. Our current state archaeologist, Amanda Grunhove, has been the state archaeologist for several years now, and her offices are based just up by the Minnesota Historical Society up on Kellogg. There's a lot of information on their website that you can go to, the OSA, that's Office of State Archaeologist website for Minnesota, where you can find research materials and reports of archaeologists from recent legacy projects that they've done. Because part of the Legacy Memo, which is a fantastic addition to our Constitution, giving money to the arts and cultural events, those projects have to be published and available to the public by and large in some capacity, whether or not it's on a website like Historic St. Paul or at the OSA's website. There's also the website for the State Historic Preservation Office, which is within the Department of Administration. They have information there as well, especially if you are trying to preserve parts of your home or bring it up to code, or maybe you're in a historic neighborhood and you want to know how you can do remodeling in your house and still stay within code for your historic district you live in. So they have information there as well. So there's a lot of different places. You can also contact an archaeologist. The State Historic Preservation Office and the Office of State Archaeologists both have lists for archaeologists that are doing work in the area. You can certainly contact me at Nino Cultural Consultants. Be happy to come out and talk, especially if you're in the St. Paul area. Just with my own interest, you can reach out to me, and I'm sure my information will become available as part of this, and you can get it from the report as well.
Definitely in Historic St. Paul. We'll try to put as many of those links as possible. Also, I think we've talked about this. If you're willing, Jeremy, I know that Historic St. Paul would like to do some sort of live Q&A with you, probably virtually again.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
So that once people have a listen to this, we can do a little question and answer, make some connections between people that are interested in this information.
That'd be great.
So look for that as well, or for the recording of it if you're listening to this years from now. Just want to thank you, Jeremy, for not just for joining us today to talk about all of this, but for all of your attention to detail and willingness to volunteer on this project for several years and to bring all this information to light. I know that it was enormously helpful in the effort to save 412 Goodrich. So thanks so much for your involvement in all of this, Jeremy.
You're very welcome. It's been a great pleasure to do it.
Excellent. And with that, I think we're done. Historic St. Paul is excited to tell you about several significant updates that have occurred since the recording of this conversation. First and foremost, 412 Goodrich has been sold and is now, once again, a family home to proud owners Murnell Kirshner and Adrian Schramm. Second, all of the catalog objects, including the notorious monkey's paw, are permanently archived at the Ramsey County Historical Society, where they will be made available for public access. Some non-cataloged items are in the possession of Historic St. Paul and may be available for viewing in the future. Lastly, Historic St. Paul is currently working on 2 video documentary projects about 412 Goodrich. One focuses on the preservation of the house and its history, while the other concentrates specifically on the archaeology project. Stay tuned to Historic St. Paul for information about these projects as they progress towards completion. Thanks again for joining us.